took her up somewhere nice in Kenya and proposed.
It's very romantic. There's a true romantic in that.
There is.
The palace was holding its breath. Over Windsor, the morning sun pushed weakly through a thin veil of mist, its light sliding over the castle's old stone like a hand too afraid to knock. It should have been an ordinary royal morning, predictable and perfectly arranged. But it wasn't. Something felt off. The quiet inside those walls wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, watchful, like a secret waiting to speak. Hallways that usually buzzed with polite footsteps and low conversation now felt frozen, trapped between heartbeats. Shoes tapped softer. Voices dropped to murmurs. Even the grandfather clock in the west corridor seemed to hesitate before each tick. Staff moved quickly but carefully, eyes flicking toward closed doors, dodging questions no one dared to voice. Outside, the world had already begun to tremble. News desks, royal reporters, and devoted monarchists scanned every update about the Princess of Wales. Official statements were polished, neat, and painfully controlled. Inside, the mood was nothing like the press releases. Beneath the gold-framed portraits and practiced calm, fear had rooted itself. Catherine, adored across continents, had been in hospital care for weeks. The public was told she was resting, healing, wrapped in her family's love. But the truth inside the palace was far more breakable. Doctors slipped in and out of her private suite with measured focus. A wing that usually stayed invisible had become the quiet epicenter of a nation's anxiety. Prince William rarely stepped away from her side. He paced sterile corridors for hours, phone in hand, checking every notification as if one might rewrite reality. Those near him said his words were few, clipped, almost absent. Sleep only came when his body surrendered, and even then it was shallow, restless. His world had collapsed into a single mission: stay close, believe, and keep praying. There was a painful kind of dignity in the way he moved. To the cameras, he still appeared polished, controlled, the steady air holding the crown's weight. Behind doors, the edges had started to fray. Worry hollowed his gaze. His voice, once unshakable at podiums, trembled when he said her name. That morning unfolded like all the others until a nurse stepped into view at the end of the corridor. Her face was pale, unreadable, her hands locked around a single file. In that instant, everyone knew the day would not end the way it began. Something irreversible had already been set into motion. Her posture was professional, her face serene, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. She approached slowly, respectfully, and stopped before him. "She's asking for you, Your Royal Highness." It was a simple sentence. Yet in that instant time seemed to lose its order. The world outside, press, ceremony, and expectations ceased to exist. There was only that room beyond the door. William rose quietly, his breath shallow. He had walked through many doors in his life into council chambers, war zones, and grand halls, but none felt as daunting as this one. As he stepped through, the muted hum of medical machinery filled the air, the steady rhythm of life measured in digital pulses. Catherine lay in her bed, her face pale yet radiant in the way only she could be. Grace had always followed her like sunlight, even in the darkest places. She turned her head and smiled faintly when she saw him. That smile, the same one that had charmed the world, held no fear, only peace. William took her hand. It was cool, delicate, yet firm, with a kind of quiet strength. For a long moment, neither spoke. Their silence said everything words could not. The man who had stood in front of nations now found himself powerless in front of the woman he loved. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Yet every word seemed to carve itself into the air. "My love," she began. "Promise me you will keep smiling for them." He frowned slightly, not yet understanding. "For whom?" he asked gently. "For them and for the people," she replied, her voice trembling, but steady in spirit. "They need to see hope in your eyes, even when I am gone." The word gone hung between them, fragile and final. William's chest tightened. He had known this moment might come, but knowing and accepting were not the same. "Don't speak like that," he whispered, pressing her hand to his lips. "You're getting stronger." But Catherine only smiled again, a slow, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "You've always been my strength," she said softly. "And I have always been your peace." Her words broke him in ways no public tragedy ever could. The nurse, sensing the sanctity of the moment, slipped quietly out of the room, leaving them in sacred privacy. The morning light filtered through the hospital window, bathing her in gold. It was the kind of light that belongs to memories. She looked at him with calm determination. "I want you to tell the children stories," she murmured. "Keep them laughing. Let them feel joy when they think of me. I don't want their hearts to remember sadness." William swallowed hard. His voice trembled. "Catherine, please." She reached up, her hand brushing his cheek, her eyes locked onto his. "We both know some goodbyes begin long before they are spoken," she said. "But this is not the end. When you see George smile, when Charlotte sings, when Louis laughs at your silly jokes, remember my love, I am there." He closed his eyes, unable to stop the tears now tracing down his face. For years, he had been taught that emotion must never break through the armor of duty. But at that moment, duty was irrelevant. All that mattered was love, the kind that transcends titles, crowns, and kingdoms. She paused, her breath shallow, her gaze still tender. "Heaven," she whispered, "has its own way of staying near." And then came silence.
That she was admitted
Not
to
the
the
kind
London
that feels
clinic here
empty,
in central
but
London,
the kind that carries weight,
yesterday for
the kind that
planned
lingers
abdominal
because it holds something eternal. William bowed his head, his body shaking quietly. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of machines and the muffled toll of the palace clock striking 12. Outside, the kingdom continued in motion, unaware that within these walls, its future king had just lost his greatest love. He pressed his forehead to her hand, whispering words meant only for her promises, apologies, memories woven in tears. When he finally stood, his shoulders were heavy, his heart fractured, but somehow still beating, because even in death, she had left him purpose. As he walked back through the corridor, the nurse stood waiting, their eyes met, and no words were needed. The silence returned deeper this time, spreading through the palace like a shroud. Somewhere beyond those stone walls, the world still believed in recovery and hope in another official update. But within Windsor, everyone knew something sacred had ended. And for the first time in a long while, the palace, its portraits, its chandeliers, its endless echoes of lineage felt heartbreak like any ordinary home. Her final whisper. The room was still, the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath, suspended between two worlds. The medical staff had retreated to the outer corridor, and even the beeping of the monitors felt gentler, as though the machines themselves understood they were intruding upon something sacred. Prince William remained by Catherine's bedside, motionless, except for the tightening of his fingers around hers. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt locked. Every word seemed too small, too fragile to carry the weight of what lingered unspoken between them. She looked at him for a long while as if memorizing his face. The strength in her gaze was startling. Here was the woman who had stood beside him through public storms and private uncertainties, through endless ceremonies and quiet laughter at home. The woman who had balanced crown and motherhood with grace, and who now, even in frailty, exuded quiet majesty. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "The first time we brought George to the balcony?" William nodded, managing a faint smile. "You told me not to wave too much, or he'd think it was a game." A light laugh escaped her lips, delicate and fading quickly. "You did wave too much," she whispered. "You always tried to make him laugh, even when the world was watching." Her hand trembled in his, and he steadied it gently. The smallness of the moment, a shared memory of laughter, felt immense. Outside those walls, a nation was already bracing for news. Inside, two souls clung to fragments of an ordinary life that had once felt eternal. "Promise me," Catherine said after a pause, her voice thinner now, "that you'll never let them forget the sound of laughter in this house." He closed his eyes. "I promise," he said, his voice breaking. She smiled faintly, a quiet satisfaction softening her features. You've always been good at keeping promises, except the one about taking fewer night calls. He almost laughed through the tears. You never let me forget that, did you? Her eyes flickered toward the ceiling where the morning light had begun to shift to gold. I'm not afraid, she said suddenly. I thought I would be, but I'm not. William felt the words hit him like a blow. Catherine, she turned to him, her gaze calm, almost luminous. I've seen too much goodness to fear. What comes next? I've seen it in you, in the children and people we've met. That's what I want you to hold on to. He shook his head, tears streaming now. Don't talk like this. We'll find another way. There's still hope. There is always hope, she said softly. But sometimes it looks different from what we expect. For a moment, her eyes drifted toward the window where the sunlight played against the glass. She seemed far away, as though she could already see something beyond the walls, beyond the pain. You once told me, she murmured, that love makes us brave. You were right. He could barely breathe. You made me brave, he said. A silence followed, gentle, heavy, eternal. She looked at him again, her lips moving faintly. He leaned closer to hear her. Promise me something else, she whispered. Anything. When you smile in public, don't let it be for duty. Let it be for life. Let it be because you still believe in what we began together. William pressed her hand against his chest. I don't know how to do any of this without you. Her fingers moved weakly, brushing against his. You already do, she said. You just haven't seen it yet. A faint shiver passed through her body, and her breath slowed. Every second felt suspended. He wanted to call for the doctors, to stop time, to beg for one more hour, but she met his eyes with a small shake of her head. Stay, she whispered. He stayed. She smiled again, that soft, radiant smile the world had fallen in love with. Tell the children, she said, pausing for strength, that I love them beyond words. That no distance can take that away. And when they're older, tell them I saw heaven in their laughter. William's heart broke quietly. He bent his head against her hand. I'll tell them, he whispered. The clock outside struck once a quiet toll that seemed to mark the moment between breath and eternity. Catherine's eyes began to close. Her voice became a thread of air. When you see the children smile, she whispered, you will see me. And when the world feels too heavy, remember, my love, that heaven has its own way of staying near. Her words lingered in the still air, fragile and eternal. William's tears fell freely now, unchecked. He had wept before, but never like this. Never with the helplessness of a man who would give up everything for one more heartbeat beside her. He kissed her forehead, whispering words only she could hear. I love you always. For a brief instant, her fingers tightened in his, a final echo of life, of connection. Then her hand grew still. The machines hummed softly. The morning light spilled fully across her face. William bowed his head and wept. The sound was not loud. It was quiet, reverent, human, the kind of grief that does not seek witnesses. A nurse entered. Quietly, her expression composed, but her eyes wet. She looked at William, then at the still figure of the princess, and silently drew the curtain. Outside, the palace clock struck again, the chime carrying across the courtyard. Life continued as it always had, but within those walls the world had shifted forever. William remained seated, holding her hand long after the room had emptied. His tears had dried, leaving the quiet ache of something sacred gone. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the serenity that lingered on her face, the faint trace of peace, as if she had simply drifted into rest. When he finally rose, the nurse was waiting near the doorway, holding out a folded cloth for him to wipe his face. He nodded, but said nothing. Words no longer felt adequate. He walked out into the corridor where the royal physician waited. The man gave a respectful bow, murmured something William barely heard, and turned away. Every step down that corridor felt heavier than the last. He passed portraits of ancestors, monarchs, soldiers, queens, all of them framed in gilded silence. For the first time, he felt the unbearable loneliness of legacy. The crown, the lineage, the destiny, none of it could mend what he had just lost. As he reached the doorway to the chapel corridor, he paused. He turned once more toward the room he had left behind. His voice was barely audible, a whisper that only the walls could hear. "Good night, my darling." And with that, the future king stepped into the longest night of his life. The aftermath within the walls. The corridors of Windsor were never meant to carry grief. They had seen coronations, jubilees, and history etched in ceremony. But that morning they carried only silence, the kind that moves like fog through old stone and polished wood. Servants moved softly, unsure whether to speak or bow, as though the very act of acknowledgement might disturb the fragile air. Prince William sat alone in the chapel, where the faint scent of candles mixed with cold marble and echoes of ancient prayers. His military jacket lay beside him, forgotten. The crown's heir had become simply a man mourning his wife. The morning light filtered through stained glass and threads of crimson and blue, spilling across the pews like a painting of sorrow. He did not cry loudly. His grief was quiet, internal, the kind that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. For a time, no one approached him. Even the courtiers who had served generations of monarchs seemed at a loss. Finally, it was Camilla, the queen consort, who entered. Her steps were soft, her face pale, but steady. She said nothing at first, only walked toward him and rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. She was light, William murmured, his voice barely audible. Every room she entered felt alive. Camilla's eyes glistened as she nodded. "And she still is, William," she said quietly. "Light doesn't die. It just changes form." He turned to her, then, his expression stripped of the royal composure the world knew so well. "How do you keep breathing?" he asked softly. "When the air no longer feels like it belongs to you." Camilla's answer came after a long pause. "You remember that the air is filled with them. Every breath carries the love that never left." It was the kind of answer that could only come from someone who had known loss deeply and learned to live beside it. Outside in the palace courtyard, preparations had already begun. The chief press secretary met quietly with royal aides, choosing words for the inevitable announcement. The palace would confirm the passing peacefully, surrounded by family. They rehearsed the phrasing, ensuring it carried dignity without excess emotion. But inside, behind the formality, hearts were breaking. In another wing, King Charles waited. He had aged years in a matter of hours. The steady voice of monarchy, the one that had guided his son through countless duties, was now cracked with sorrow. When William finally entered his father's study, the two men looked at each other, wordless, bound, not by protocol, but by shared loss. Charles rose from his chair. No speeches, no formal greetings. He simply embraced his son. William's shoulders shook against his father's chest, the crown air breaking in his father's arms. "Take time," Charles whispered. "The nation will wait." But William, ever the soldier, shook his head. "She wouldn't want to delay. She'd want me to keep going for the children." His voice trembled on the last word. The king nodded, but his eyes betrayed understanding. "Then let the nation grieve with you," he said softly. "You do not need to carry this alone." By evening, the first vigil began. The sun had barely set when candles flickered to life outside Buckingham Palace. Thousands gathered in silence, holding flowers, photographs, and letters. No royal directive had called them there. They simply came drawn by love, by shock, by the instinct to mourn the woman who had felt more like family than royalty. Television crews arrived, but spoke in whispers. Reporters abandoned their usual urgency, their words softened by sincerity. "The nation waits," one anchor said quietly, for confirmation of what many already fear. Back inside the palace, William sat with his children. The nursery felt painfully unchanged. The same books, the same toys, the faint scent of Catherine's perfume lingering on the pillows she had kissed goodnight. George sat closest to him, his small hand resting on his father's knee. Charlotte's eyes, wide and uncertain, darted between her brothers. Louis leaned against William's arm, too young to grasp the permanence of loss, yet sensing the change in the air. William swallowed hard before speaking. "Mommy loved you more than words can say," he whispered, forcing his voice to remain steady. "And she told me something just for us." George looked up, his lip trembling. "What did she say, Papa?" William hesitated. The memory of her voice felt both healing and unbearable. "She said that when we see each other smile, we'll see her too. That every time we laugh, she'll be near." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Charlotte climbed into his lap, whispering, "Can she see us now?" William's throat tightened. "Yes, my darling, she's watching us right now." Louis, barely understanding, pointed toward the window. "Is she in the stars?" William smiled through tears. "Yes, maybe she's the brightest one." Their innocence cut deeper than any headline ever could. For all the centuries of royal history surrounding them, this was simply a father holding his children, a family shattered but still breathing. In the hallway outside, Carol and Michael Middleton stood quietly, arms wrapped around each other. They had been dignified through every chapter of Catherine's royal life, but now they were simply parents grieving their daughter. Palace staff, hardened by decades of duty, averted their eyes, many fighting tears of their own. That night, Windsor slept uneasily. The palace, so often alive with preparation for ceremony and state, now felt like a mausoleum. The portraits of past monarchs watched in painted silence, as though even they could sense the shift in the absence of light where it had once dwelled. Near midnight, William returned to the chapel. He lit a single candle at the altar where he had sat that morning. The flame flickered weakly at first, then steadied, its glow reflecting in his tear-streaked eyes. He knelt, his hands clasped loosely, his voice a whisper. "Thank you," he said. He didn't elaborate. There was no need. The words carried everything. Gratitude, grief, love, faith, and the fragile acceptance that the woman who had defined his world had left him a mission far greater than himself. In the distance, the wind swept through the gardens, rustling the magnolia she loved. It was a small sound, almost unnoticed, yet William heard it. It was as if the world itself sighed with him. By dawn, the press office released the statement. 37 words chosen with care, sent across the world. The Princess of Wales passed peacefully, surrounded by her family. Her kindness, courage, and grace will be remembered by the world she so deeply touched. The news spread with quiet devastation. Bells tolled across cities and villages, flags lowered to half-mast. And as the sun rose once more over Windsor, the palace remained still. Its heart forever changed. The nation mourns. The news broke just after sunrise. Across television screens, phones, and radios, the announcement echoed like a distant bell. The Princess of Wales has passed peacefully, surrounded by her family. For a brief moment, Britain stood still. Commuters froze mid-step. Shopkeepers paused before opening their doors. The hum of a waking nation softened into collective disbelief. In London, the first to arrive at Kensington Palace were not reporters, but citizens. Mothers with pram, veterans in medals, school children clutching hand-picked flowers. They gathered at the Black Iron Gates, the same gates that had once overflowed with tributes decades earlier for another princess lost too soon. Bouquets began to pile against the railings of lilies, roses, and wild flowers from local gardens, each carrying a handwritten note. "She was our hope," one card read. Another said simply, "Thank you, Catherine, for teaching us grace." By midday, the crowd had grown into thousands. Television cameras rolled, but the reporters spoke softly, as if afraid to break the reverence. For once, even the British press seemed humbled by the gravity of the moment. At Westminster Abbey, the great bells told their solemn rhythm cutting through the autumn air. Flags across the Commonwealth lowered to half-mast. In Edinburgh, Sydney, Ottawa, and Wellington, public vigils formed spontaneously. Candles flickered in churchyards and strangers held hands in London's St. James's Park. A choir of children sang quietly beneath the weeping willows. Their voices trembled with innocence, rising through the chill morning air in tribute to the woman who had knelt beside so many children in hospitals and schools, who had made kindness seem like duty. Within Windsor Castle, the royal household moved through rehearsed precision, but this was no ceremony. Courtiers wore black armbands, their composure brittle. The royal kitchen halted its usual bustle. Even the guards at the gates carried themselves with a softer stillness, as though aware that the nation's gaze was not on pomp, but pain. Prince William did not appear in public that day. He remained with his children, protecting what little privacy they had left. In their private quarters, a gentle rain streaked the window panes. George stood beside him, watching raindrops race down the glass. "It's like the sky is crying, Papa," he whispered. William placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes," he said quietly. "Maybe heaven misses her, too." That afternoon, King Charles addressed the nation from Buckingham Palace. The speech was brief, measured, heartfelt, and uncharacteristically personal. His voice trembled only once when he said her name. "She brought warmth to every corner of our family and every heart she touched across this nation." He said, "Her example of service and grace will remain a guiding light for us all." Around Britain, people wept. In small villages, church bells joined the chorus of mourning. On television, historians drew parallels to Princess Diana's passing, though they spoke carefully. Catherine's story was her own, a modern queen in spirit, a woman who carried centuries of tradition with unstudied humanity. At Westminster, the Archbishop of Canterbury held a brief reflection. "She showed us that compassion need not bow to power, that kindness is a form of courage," he said, his voice echoing through the vast cathedral. In hospitals she had visited, nurses lit candles in her honor. At primary schools across England, teachers spoke to students about her charity work. Children drew pictures of her smiling face and left them on classroom windows. In a quiet corner of Berkshire, Carol and Michael Middleton sat together, their faces etched with heartbreak. For them, this was not a royal tragedy, but the loss of a daughter who had once baked cakes in their kitchen and laughed at the smallest things. "She was never trying to be perfect," Carol whispered to a friend. "She was just trying to be kind." That evening, the rain stopped. The clouds parted to reveal a stretch of pale blue sky over London. At exactly 8 o'clock, the palace organized a moment of national reflection. Across the United Kingdom, lights dimmed. Big Ben stood silent. Cities fell still. Millions held candles at their windows. In Windsor, William stood on the terrace with his children. The flicker of candlelight reflected in the windows of the palace below, a sea of gold stretching into the distance. Charlotte leaned against his arm and whispered, "Mommy would like all the lights." He smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "Yes, my love," he said. She would. The following morning, newspapers across the world printed the same image. Catherine's portrait framed in soft light beneath the headline, "The People's Princess Reborn." Commentators spoke of her humility, her compassion, her refusal to be distant from those she served. She had redefined what it meant to be royal, not through spectacle, but through presence. In Parliament, the Prime Minister's voice broke as she addressed the chamber. "Her Royal Highness taught us that true leadership lies in empathy. She will remain not just in history, but in our hearts." Even those who had never met her felt her absence like the loss of a family member. Strangers left flowers for someone they had only seen on screens, but somehow felt they knew. The nation's grief transcended protocol. Back at Windsor, preparations for the funeral began quietly. Plans that had been written years earlier under the code name Operation Lily were now being set in motion. The palace would ensure dignity, but William made one request: no excessive grandeur. He wanted her farewell to reflect who she had been: elegant, humble, radiant in simplicity. As the days passed, the royal family gathered strength and unity. The Queen Consort oversaw the ceremonial details. The king met daily with advisors, but all eyes turned toward William, who would soon have to face the nation. Behind closed doors, he practiced his speech for the memorial. He stood in an empty room, reading aloud to the air. "She was my compass," he said softly. "She showed me how to lead without hardness, how to serve without pride." His voice faltered as he reached the words. "She told me to keep smiling." He lowered the paper and looked out the window toward the courtyard below. The scent of rain lingered, mingled with the faint perfume of the flowers flooding the gates. Somewhere beyond the crowd continued to grow, their candles reflecting in the puddles along the road. The sound of quiet sobs drifted upward through the still air. And in that moment, standing at the window of Windsor, Prince William understood what she had meant by her final whisper. Heaven has its own way of staying near the legacy she left behind. Weeks passed, though time seemed to move differently, now quieter, heavier, as if the world itself had paused to adjust to her absence. The palace resumed its routines, but the rhythm was slower, softer. Cora spoke gently. Footsteps echoed longer in the halls. Even the gardens, so often alive with laughter and music, seemed to mourn her still. Yet amid the stillness, something beautiful began to emerge. The world did not forget Catherine. It remembered her with a tenderness rarely granted to those of power. Her face graced murals. Her words appeared in classrooms. Her work, especially with children and mental health, continued to bloom through those she had inspired. Her kindness had become a living thing, passed from hand to hand, quietly refusing to fade. Prince William felt that most of all. Each morning he woke to the muffled sound of life continuing outside his window. Staff greeting one another, horses in the courtyard, the first carriage departing for official duties. It was strange how the world could keep moving while one's heart remained still. But then he would hear laughter, light, unguarded laughter from down the corridor, and he would know the children were awake. And in that laughter, he heard her. He began taking them for walks again, just as she had loved to do, through Windsor's gardens, beneath the magnolia, and along the narrow paths by the water. George walked ahead, hands in his pockets, trying to appear grown. Charlotte gathered wild flowers for the table. Louis darted from one tree to the next, chasing his shadow. William followed quietly, his grief tempered by gratitude. In public, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture remained regal, but his eyes carried a new depth. There was a warmth there, a softness that had not been seen before. He no longer spoke from duty alone. He spoke from the heart. At appearances, he lingered longer with children, clasped hands more firmly, looked people in the eye. The world could see it. Love had changed him. When the time came for the memorial service, Windsor was blanketed in pale mist once more. St. George's Chapel stood solemn and golden in the morning light, its bells tolling with gentle reverence. Foreign dignitaries, world leaders, and thousands of citizens filled the grounds. Yet, despite the grandeur, the atmosphere was intimate, more like a gathering of family than a state ceremony. Inside, the choir began to sing her favorite hymn, their voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling, each note carrying the ache of remembrance and the quiet faith of love enduring beyond sight. The children sat in the front row holding hands. Their faces were pale, their composure far beyond their years. Beside them, William sat. Still, his expression steady, but his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When his turn came to speak, he rose slowly and approached the lectern. The cathedral fell into perfect silence. Cameras from around the world focused on him, yet he seemed unaware of them. He spoke not as a prince, but as a husband, a father, and a man still learning how to live without the other half of his heart. "She was my compass," he began, his voice measured, calm. "She showed me that strength and gentleness are not opposites, but partners. She taught me how to serve not by position, but by compassion." He paused, taking a slow breath. Catherine believed that kindness could rebuild the world one act at a time. And she was right. I see it now in our children, in the people she touched, in the countless lives changed by her quiet devotion. He looked down briefly, his composure wavering. "She told me before she left us that when I see our children smile, I will see her, and I do every day." A faint tremor ran through his voice. "So I ask you," he continued, "not to mourn her absence, but to carry her example forward. Live her kindness, share her gentleness, let her light guide you as it guides us." When he stepped back, the crowd rose in silent unity. The sound of gentle weeping filled the air, mingled with the rustle of programs and the soft creak of pews. Outside, the bells rang once more, their echo carrying across the fields and into the hearts of millions watching around the world. In the days that followed, the royal family returned to quiet life. Yet everything felt transformed. William spent his evenings reading bedtime stories in the same voice that had once made Catherine laugh. He began to visit her favorite charities, often without cameras, continuing her work, not from obligation, but love. Each visit was a conversation with her spirit. Each act of service a way of keeping her close. He commissioned a small statue in the palace garden, not of grandeur or triumph, but of grace. It showed Catherine seated on a stone bench, smiling gently, her hands open as if welcoming the world. Around her, 3 children stood, each holding a flower. Beneath the statue, an inscription read, "Where kindness reigns, love never dies." The world came to see it. Visitors left notes at its base, not of mourning, but of gratitude. Letters from mothers, teachers, nurses, and strangers who had never met her yet felt they had known her all along. At night, when the crowds dispersed and the palace lights dimmed, William often walked alone through the gardens. The magnolia glowed faintly in the moonlight, their petals trembling in the wind. He would stop before the statue, his hands clasped loosely, and whisper the same words he had spoken in that hospital room. Heaven has its own way of staying near. And in that moment, he felt her presence not as a ghost or memory, but as peace. History would remember Catherine as the Princess of Wales, the wife of a future king. But to William, she remained something far greater, his home, his anchor, his reason. And through her, the monarchy itself rediscovered its heart. Because in the end, her greatest legacy was not charity or ceremony. It was love, quiet, steadfast, royal in its humility. Love that reminded the world that, even behind crowns and corridors of power, there beats a human heart capable of breaking, capable of healing, and capable of hope. Catherine's story reminds us that grace is not found in grandeur, but in compassion. If her journey moved you, honor her legacy by showing kindness to someone today. Subscribe for more royal stories where behind every crown lies a heartbeat, and behind every headline, a human soul.